Now we learned how to listen to events. Now here's one important thing. Currently, I'm updating the counter here in my HTML code. In the view controlled parts, but in the HTML code. And it generally is considered a bad or not optimal practice to do that. You don't want to put too much logic into your HTML code. Instead, the HTML code should really just be about outputting stuff. Logic like this, even though it's not too complex, should typically go into your JavaScript code. Now, how could we get this logic into our JavaScript code? Well, we want to do something on every click. What do you typically use if you want to do something at a certain point of time, potentially in a repeated way? Well, you need a function that can be called. You need a function which you can call when the add button is clicked, and you need a function which you can call when the reduce button is clicked. Now, of course, we could specify a function here, add, and there try to set counter equal to counter plus 1. But for multiple reasons, this wouldn't work. For one, counter is not a globally available variable. It is a data property, hence it's not available here. In addition, even if it would be available for whatever reason, add now is a globally created function, but in your view-controlled HTML code, you can't use such a function. You can only use in this view-controlled HTML part what is defined in your Vue app. And that's why we use methods for that. And we did already learn about methods before. Now, we don't just use methods to manually call them as we did before. We can also use methods to connect them to event listeners and let Vue call them for us when a certain event occurs. For example, here we can add an add method, though this name here is totally up to you. You could also name it add counter or increment or whatever you want, but I'll name it add. And in here, you can now update this counter. Just important, as you learned, with this counter. In your JavaScript code, you refer to your data properties with this. This counter plus plus, or the longer form this counter equals this counter plus 1. It's the same. And with that, we have a method which we can call to update our counter. Now, this method doesn't return anything because it doesn't have to. We'll not use the method like we did before to dynamically output something here. Instead, we're using it to run it when a click occurs. And therefore, this doesn't need to return anything because the click listener doesn't want a return value. So now here, we can call add like this. And if I now save that and reload, I can click add and it still works, because we're executing the same code just in a different way. And this is actually the better way of doing it. Putting your logic into JavaScript and just pointing at that logic, that is generally considered better, even though technically it here works in the same way. But consider cases where you have more complex logic, and it quickly makes sense that you should put that logic into JavaScript and not into HTML, so it's not bad to get started with that as a habit right from the start. Now, besides calling add like this, by the way, you can also just point at it, so that you tell Vue, hey, that's the name of the function, or of the method to be precise, you should execute when a click occurs. Vue accepts both. You explicitly calling it like this, or you pointing at it. Vue detects what you're doing and it will do the right thing in both cases. Now, typically you just want to point at it, since that is closer to vanilla JavaScript and how you would set up an event listener there, but it is worth noting that both syntaxes are allowed, as you can see here. Well, and now let's do the same for reducing our counter. Of course, try this on your own. Here's a quick pause for you to do that, and thereafter we'll do it together. Were you successful? Well, again, it's pretty much the same code. We can add a reduce method. Again, this name is up to you. And in there, we just set this counter equal to this counter minus 1, or we use the shorter form, which looks like this, which is also okay. And now in here on this second button, we can call reduce like this, or as I just mentioned, just point at it. Both is accepted. And now we got our working buttons with one important change. Now the logic is outsourced into JavaScript, which is where your logic should be, and the HTML code is leaner. And this is better. This is considered to be better, so it is a good idea to get started with this approach and with this pattern. Now, that is how we can use methods. We can not just use them in curly braces or with vbind to dynamically derive a value we want to output, but we can also use them with event listeners to define code that should be executed when the event occurs. And in reality, you will more often use methods to connect them to events than you will use them to output something dynamically derived. I just showed this before to show you that it's possible and to introduce methods, but typically you'll use them like this in combination with event listeners.